we're getting to, when it comes to the balance between consumer control and brand control, we're certainly seeing the rise of consumer control. But I think that's good. Brands haven't paid enough attention to what consumers want to be able to accomplish and want to do. But I think the ultimate place that we're going to net out is a good combination of both. Because consumers are not interested in patronizing brands that have no personality of their own. Just like we don't really like hanging out with people who are just trying to figure out what we want to hear, and they're like, "Oh yeah, Leah, I exactly agree with that." And we look forward to personality. So some of the brands that are really thriving in the digital age are those that have a very strong personality. Certainly Apple does, Patagonia does, REI, Whole Foods, especially before they were acquired by Amazon. They know who they are, and they're not trying to change who they are to be what you want them to be. At the same time, they understand how that intersects with what you want to be. And more importantly, I think, is which audience is the audience that is aligned with them and what they want to do. Because if you are culturally aligned with that brand, take a Patagonia, then whether or not the consumer is in control or the brand is in control doesn't matter as much, because you're all kind of playing together in the same sandbox. So I think that's where we're netting out, is that consumers are starting to find the brands that share their values, share their point of view. And when that happens, you have a much more seamless and natural conversation.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Kelly is saying. We're definitely seeing the rise of the consumer. If anything that's occurred during this pandemic, how vocal and how much they vote with their clicks is obviously even more obvious. But as Kelly mentioned, the connection of the brand with the consumer, of being purpose-driven, what's impactful, like Patagonia and their mission and approach. But now, more than important, consumers' trust of brands is so critical, especially with data breaches and the things that we have seen that have been occurring. Trust is going to be such a big thing. But looking at all this social activity of diversity and inclusion, consumers are really going to try to align themselves with, well, what company best meets my personal beliefs? And if you think about what's occurred, but more importantly, these generations. And as generations come of age, especially the younger generation, they're pretty passionate in their beliefs. So I think we're going to continue to see the consumer influence brands, but brands obviously have to recognize what's important, what's in alignment, and where do we want to play.
And I think I'm going to layer on with that a little bit, but more tactically. I think social media I feel like we're going to see social media shift really quicker, shift faster than we think, Gordon, because people realize that they're being fed certain things, and depending upon what they're clicking on, they aren't getting fed other things. And I think that some people might be okay being naive and living in that world, but I think other people want to understand the story better. They want to understand the bigger picture. And I think this puts pressure on brands to own their audience on their websites and on their own digital platforms, not those, manipulated by the Googles or the Facebooks or the Instagrams or the TikToks of the world. So, I think that the transparency element and making sure that, brands are, when people get there, they're understanding that they are capturing data and they are trying to, use these things in the right way for the user experience. Like, let's be clear about that digital is doing what digital does well, but make it so the user and so that brand loyalist can have the better experience and gain from it, not just, be used by you.
Yeah, all good thoughts. What about, all right, each of you mentioned some level of trust and matching expectations with your audiences. What about, and this is a harder question, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway, brands having to align with platforms that share those values? It's easy to identify your target customers, Do you foresee brands having to pick and choose the battlegrounds, for lack of better terms, you know, that maybe align with their values of transparency or trust or privacy versus whatever Facebook is doing these days? You know, do you foresee brands having to pick and choose? Do they go down the Facebook route or the you know, whatever the more trustworthy social network is out there? And if so, how does that impact your relationship with consumers? Because now all of a sudden the Venn diagram gets a little bit more.
Well, B2B, I'll just jump in real quick because you're looking at LinkedIn right now. Like they do not have another big social space when it comes to social networking platforms. I think there are other platforms trying to get up to speed, and you know, there's a big difference between LinkedIn today in 2020 than 2009. Like they actually realized that they had something there along the way. So just from B2B, I feel like it's just currently a lack of options of alignment. And I'm not even certain that businesses are thinking about how other businesses are using their data in a way that a consumer is. That conversation isn't necessarily front line right now. But regarding, you know, consumer stuff, it gets even trickier when you look at Facebook and Instagram being owned by the same company. You know, those types of mergers and acquisitions, when you as a marketer have to start aligning your brands with people that have mindset similarities, it's not an easy conversation, I don't think. I think it gets very complicated.
Well, you know, one thing that was really tough when you talk about the channels is what occurred with Facebook. And we really had to, from a paid advertising perspective, because it's a very effective medium, and you know, we had to stop and think, do we feel that we should be participating now? Now, it's one thing to go out vocally and say, we are participating in this boycott, but you look at your values and what do you stand for as a company? If you're telling your employees one thing and your customers the same thing, but you're not matching your actions and decisions based on your values, then you come across as, you know, being hypocritical. So I know that at least Facebook has been very challenging because there's a lot of power and influence. And let's face it, it's a big part of our lives. But when there is such a movement to boycott and your company necessarily doesn't respond, it definitely puts you in a tough position. So, Andrew, I absolutely think that the relationship or how we use channels and services, it really has to be a reflection on, as brands and companies, what do we feel is most important so that we're walking the talk?
Boy, Gordon, you couldn't be more right about that. I think that one of the things that we will absolutely see across digital marketing and traditional marketing in the future is that cultural lenses are going to dominate the way that we position and communicate around brands. And they should, right? Because if an organization says that they stand for something, for example, they stand for equal rights for all people, then they probably shouldn't be advertising on channels that don't align with those values. And we have recommended significantly at Brand Federation, I see my partner Matt Williams is also on today, you know, we believe in building brands that are more responsible. And so we're not going to recommend a platform like Facebook until they clean up their act somewhat. That doesn't mean that we don't have clients who are on Facebook, but we are recommending more and more actually consider the boycott. I think it's time to hold the platforms accountable for aligning to the values of the brands that they would like to interact with, because consumers are going to hold us all accountable for that. Now, we'd all love to live in a world that's a little bit less divisive than the world that we live in right now, and perhaps that future is ahead for us, and maybe not. I wish I could predict that. That's a piece of the future I can't predict. But I will say that you need to pick the places that you're going to show up and the places that you're going to put your brand into conversation in the same way that a musician might pick venues that they play. You know, years ago, musicians walked away from Sun City because it was supportive of apartheid. And they were right to do so. They said, I'm not going to show up in this place because it doesn't look good for me. Brands need to start to think that way.